Sometimes the people who should love you most are the ones who hurt you deepest. For Elin, that truth came when her own parents traded her away for 3 silver coins, calling her worthless because she couldn't bear children. At 32, the quiet healer had already lost her husband to shame and her village to whispers. Now she faced a merchant's cart and an uncertain fate. But King Roan was traveling these mountain roads, tired of wars and empty promises from his court, when the battle-worn king saw Elin, calm, honest, and forgotten by everyone else. Something changed in him. In front of her entire village, he kissed her hand and claimed her as his queen. Could 2 broken souls really find healing together, or would the kingdom's expectations destroy their chance at love? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the stone cottages of Greyhold like a shroud, obscuring the harsh lines of poverty that marked every weathered face in the mountain village. Elin had learned to read those lines well over her 32 years. The deep furrows of worry around her mother's eyes, the bitter creases that had formed at the corners of her father's mouth, the cold indifference that had settled over her former husband's features like winter frost that never quite melted. She adjusted the worn leather strap of her healing satchel across her shoulder, feeling the familiar weight of dried herbs, clean linen strips, and the small clay pots that held her carefully prepared salves. The satchel had been her grandmother's, passed down through 3 generations of women who had served as the village healers. Unlike the other inheritances that had skipped over Elin, the family silver, the good china, the respect that came with producing children, this leather bag had found its way to her hands because no one else wanted the burden of tending to others' pain. The cobblestones beneath her feet were slick with morning dew as she made her way toward old Henrik's cottage. His arthritis had been troubling him again with the changing weather, and she had promised to bring him a fresh batch of willow bark tea. The village was stirring to life around her, smoke beginning to curl from chimneys, shutters opening to reveal suspicious eyes that followed her passage. She had grown accustomed to those looks over the past 5 years since Garrett had left her, a mixture of pity and blame that suggested she had somehow failed at the most basic function expected of a woman. Baron Elin, some of the younger, women called her, though never to her face. They whispered it in the market square when they thought she couldn't hear, their voices carrying a peculiar mix of superiority and fear, as if her childlessness might somehow be contagious. Their own swelling bellies and children clinging to their skirts served as shields against whatever curse they imagined had befallen her. The truth was more mundane and somehow more painful than any supernatural explanation. She and Garrett had tried for 7 years to conceive, 7 years of hope, followed by the monthly disappointment that grew heavier with each passing season. The village midwife had examined her, pronouncing her womb cold and unwelcoming, though Elin suspected. The woman knew little more about such matters than the rest of them. Garrett had submitted to no such examination. In Greyhold, as in most places, the failure to conceive was always laid at the woman's feet. Henrik's cottage sat at the edge of the village proper, where the cobblestones gave way to dirt paths, and the carefully tended gardens yielded to wild mountain scrub. She knocked gently on his door, the sound echoing in the morning stillness. When he didn't answer immediately, she tested the latch and found it unlocked, a common practice in Greyhold, where poverty left little worth stealing. "Henrik?" she called softly, stepping into the dim interior. The old man sat hunched in his chair by the cold fireplace, his gnarled hands pressed against his knees. His weathered face brightened when he saw her, though she could read the pain in the tight lines around his eyes. "Elin, child," he said, his voice rough with age and disuse. "You shouldn't trouble yourself with an old fool like me." "Nonsense," she replied, setting her satchel on his rough wooden table and beginning to prepare his tea. "You were kind to me when others weren't. That's worth a bit of trouble." It was true. Henrik had been one of the few villagers who hadn't changed his behavior toward her after Garrett's departure. He still greeted her warmly, still asked for her help with his ailments, still treated her as a person rather than a walking reminder of failure. Such kindness had become precious in Greyhold. As she worked grinding the willow bark with practiced motions, Henrik watched her with sharp eyes that missed little despite his age. "Your parents came by yesterday," he said carefully. "Seemed agitated about something." Elin's hands stilled for a moment before resuming their steady rhythm. Her parents had been agitated about many things lately. Their dwindling resources, their daughter's unmarried state, their own advancing years with no grandchildren to care for them. The conversations at home had grown increasingly strained, filled with long silences and pointed remarks about her failures. "They're worried about the future," she said diplomatically, pouring hot water over the groundbark. "We all are." Henrik nodded slowly. "Times are hard, to be sure. But they seem particularly focused on you, child." Had the look of people making difficult decisions. A chill ran down Elin's spine, though she couldn't say why. Her parents had been having whispered conversations lately, talks that stopped abruptly. When she entered a room, she had attributed it to their concern about supporting her, an unmarried daughter approaching middle age with no prospects and no dowry was indeed a burden in a place like Greyhold. "Here," she said, handing Henrik the steaming cup. "Drink this twice daily, and the pain should ease. I'll bring more bark when this runs out." He accepted the cup gratefully, wrapping his arthritic fingers around its warmth. "You're a good woman, Elin. Don't let anyone tell you different." The words were kindly meant, but they struck her with unexpected force. When had her worth become something that needed defending? When had her basic goodness become a matter of debate rather than simple recognition? She gathered her supplies with practiced efficiency, her movements automatic after years of making similar visits throughout the village. Each cottage held its own sorrows, old injuries that never quite healed, children with persistent coughs, mothers worn down by too many pregnancies and too little food. She treated them all with the same gentle competence, asking no payment beyond what people could afford and accepting payment in kind when coin was scarce. The walk back through the village centre took her past the market square, where early vendors were setting up their modest wares. Garrett stood near the blacksmith's stall, examining a new horseshoe with the sort of focused attention he had once reserved for her. He had remarried within a year of their separation, a young widow named Mara, who had quickly provided him with the son that Elin never could. The boy, now 3 years old, clung to his father's leg with bright, curious eyes. Their gazes met across the square, and for a moment, time seemed suspended. Garrett's expression was unreadable, not hostile, not kind, simply indifferent. She might have been looking at a stranger for all the recognition she saw in his eyes. The man who had once promised to love her through all of life's trials now regarded her with the same mild interest he might show a piece of livestock at market. Mara appeared at his side, her hand resting protectively on her rounded belly. Another child was expected before winter's end. She whispered something in Garrett's ear, and he nodded without taking his eyes off Elin. The message was clear enough. She was a part of his past that he preferred to leave buried. Elin forced herself to walk calmly past them, her head held high, despite the burning sensation in her chest. She had loved Garrett once, or thought she had. Looking back, she wondered if what she had felt was love, or simply the relief of being chosen, the comfort of fitting into the expected pattern of village life. His abandonment had hurt, but not as deeply as she had expected. The loss of his regard was painful, but the loss of her place in the community's structure had been devastating. Her parents' cottage sat on a narrow lane behind the baker's shop, its thatched roof showing signs of age and wear that they couldn't afford to repair. She could hear voices inside as she approached, her mother's higher tones mixing with a deeper, unfamiliar rumble. A visitor, then, and early in the day, for social calls. She paused at the door, her hand on the latch, struck by an odd reluctance to enter her own home. Henrik's warning echoed in her mind. Her parents had the look of people making difficult decisions. What decisions could they be making that involved her without her knowledge? The voices inside grew more distinct as she listened, her mother's words carrying clearly through the thin walls. She's strong and healthy, and she knows her herbs. That's worth something, surely. Not as much as you might think, came the unfamiliar voice, gruff and businesslike. A woman her age, unmarried, with no children, there's always a reason for such circumstances. Still, I might be able to find a place for her. Household service, perhaps, or tending to an elderly master who needs nursing. Elin's blood turned to ice in her veins. They were discussing her as if she were a piece of property to be sold, her life reduced to a transaction between strangers. Her hand trembled on the door latch as the reality of the situation crashed over her like a mountain. Avalanche. How much? Her father's voice, carefully controlled, but tinged with desperation. 3 silver pieces, the stranger replied. And that's generous, considering her circumstances. Take it or leave it. I have other business to attend to in these mountains. 3 silver pieces, the price of her life, her freedom, her future, less than the cost of a good horse or a decent milk cow. Elin closed her eyes, feeling the world tilt beneath her feet. Her parents, the people who had brought her into this world and raised her with what she had always believed was love, were selling her to a stranger for the price of a few months' grain. She stood frozen in the morning air, her healing satchel heavy across her shoulder, listening to the people she trusted most in the world negotiate away her humanity. Inside the cottage, the conversation continued, working out the practical details of her disposal, when the transfer would take place, what few possessions she would be allowed to take, how the transaction would be explained to the village. Chaku, leather strap of her grandmother's satchel cut into her shoulder, a physical reminder of the legacy she carried. 3 generations of healers had carried this bag, had used these hands to ease suffering and bring comfort to others. Now she was to be sold like a broodmare too old for breeding, her skills and knowledge valued only for what profit they might bring to a stranger. The morning mist was beginning to lift from the village rooftops, revealing the harsh mountain peaks that surrounded Greyhold like prison walls. Somewhere beyond those peaks lay a world she had never seen, filled with possibilities she had never imagined. But that world was not meant for her. Instead, she would be dragged into whatever form of servitude this stranger had planned. Another burden to bear for people who saw her only as a commodity. She turned away from her parents' door, unable to face the moment when they would emerge and pretend that this betrayal was somehow an act of love. The village streets that had been her entire world suddenly felt foreign and hostile, filled with the judgment of people who had already written her off as worthless. The leather satchel across her shoulder felt heavier with each step, weighted down not just with herbs and remedies, but with the knowledge that even her own family saw her as nothing more than a burden to be disposed of. The morning sun climbed higher over the mountain peaks, burning away the last of the protective mist and leaving Greyhold exposed in its harsh, unforgiving light. And in that clarity, Elin understood that her old life was ending, whether she was ready or not. The confrontation came sooner than Elin had expected. She had barely reached the village well when her mother's voice cut through the morning air, sharp with forced cheer and underlying desperation. "Elin, there you are, child. Come home quickly, we have a visitor." Her mother stood in the cottage doorway, her greying hair hastily pinned and her best apron tied over her worn dress. The effort to appear respectable was touching and heartbreaking in equal measure. Behind her, Elin could see movement in the shadows, the stranger whose voice she had heard negotiating her price. "I know about the visitor, Mother," Elin said quietly, setting down the water bucket she had been carrying. "I heard enough." The color drained from her mother's face, but she maintained her brittle smile. "Then you know we've found a solution." to our difficulties. Come inside so we can discuss the arrangements properly. Arrangements, as if her life were a social engagement to be planned, rather than a human existence to be bartered away. Elin followed her mother through the doorway, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird, desperate for freedom. The stranger dominated their small main room, his bulk making the space feel even more cramped than usual. He was a man, in his 50s, with the weathered face of someone who spent his life on the road, and the calculating eyes of someone who viewed everything in terms of profit and loss. His clothes were well made but travel-stained, and a heavy purse hung from his belt, the tools of a successful merchant. "So this is the daughter," he said, looking Elin up and down with the same attention he might give to livestock at market. "She's older than I prefer, but she looks healthy enough. Can she read?" "I can speak for myself," Elin said, her voice steady despite the tremor running through her body. "And yes, I can read. I can also write, manage household accounts, and heal both common ailments and serious injuries. I am not a piece of goods to be inspected and sold." The merchant, Aldrich, her father had called him, raised an eyebrow at her directness. "Spirited. That could be useful or troublesome, depending on the position. What's this about healing? Are you a trained physician?" "She knows herbs and remedies," her father said quickly, stepping forward with his shoulders hunched in shame. "Learned from her grandmother. She's tended half the village over the years, never lost a patient to fever or infection." "Interesting." Aldrich made a note in a small leather book he pulled from his pocket. "Medical knowledge adds value, especially in remote areas where trained doctors are scarce. Yes, I can work with this." Elin watched in horrified fascination, as her parents and this stranger discussed her skills and attributes as if she weren't standing right there. Her father listed her abilities like a merchant hawking wares, her literacy, her healing knowledge, her skill with household management. Her mother added details about her character, obedient, hard-working, clean in her habits. "What exactly do you intend to do with me?" Elin asked, interrupting their catalogue of her virtues. Aldrich looked up from his notes. "I have contacts throughout the region, wealthy families who need competent household staff, elderly nobles who require personal care, merchants who need someone to manage their domestic affairs while they travel. Your age works against you for some positions, but your education and medical knowledge open other possibilities. And if I refuse?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Her parents exchanged glances, and she saw the answer in their faces before anyone spoke. "Child," her mother said gently, "we can't continue as we have. Your father's back is failing, and we can barely afford to feed ourselves through the winter. Without your marriage prospects," she stopped, unable to finish the sentence. "Without grandchildren to care for us in our old age," her father completed bluntly. "We need the coin, Elin, and you need a future that doesn't involve growing old alone in Greyhold." The honesty was brutal, and somehow more painful than continued deception would have been. She could see the genuine anguish in their faces, the knowledge that they were destroying their relationship with their only child out of sheer desperation. But understanding their motivations didn't make the betrayal any easier to bear. 3 silver pieces, she said quietly. "That's what my life is worth to you." Aldrich shifted uncomfortably. "It's a fair price given the circumstances. And it's not permanent bondage. Think of it as employment with an advance on wages. Work hard, prove your value, and you could earn your freedom within a few years. Or I could be passed from household to household like an unwanted piece of furniture, growing older and more desperate with each transfer." Elin looked at her parents, seeing them clearly perhaps for the first time in her life. "How long have you been planning this?" "Since spring," her mother admitted. "When the Hendersons' oldest son announced his engagement to the Miller girl instead of—" She stopped again, but the implication was clear. Elin had been their last hope for a prosperous marriage alliance, and when that prospect vanished, they had begun looking for other solutions to their financial problems. The cottage felt impossibly small, the walls closing in around her like the sides of a grave. Everything familiar. The worn wooden table where she had learned to read, the hearth where her grandmother had taught her to prepare medicines, the narrow bed where she had spent countless nights dreaming of a different life, suddenly felt foreign and hostile. "I need to pack my things," she said, her voice hollow. "Just clothing and personal items," Aldrich said quickly. "I can't have you carrying excessive baggage. We leave within the hour." Within the hour, 32 years of life in Greyhold, reduced to whatever possessions she could stuff into a traveling bag. Elin climbed the narrow stairs to her small room. Under the eaves, her legs feeling unsteady beneath her. The space was barely large enough for a bed and a small chest, but it had been hers, the only place in the village where she could retreat from the constant weight of judgment and disappointment. Her few dresses lay folded in the chest, along with her grandmother's recipe book and a small collection of pressed flowers she had kept from childhood. The healing satchel would come with her, of course. It was the one thing of value she truly owned, and her only hope of earning some measure of independence in whatever situation awaited her. As she folded her belongings into her grandmother's old traveling bag, she could hear the murmur of voices from below. Her parents and Aldrich were finalizing their transaction, working out the last details of her sale. The metallic clink of coins changing hands reached her ears, and she had to grip the edge of her bed to keep from collapsing. 3 silver pieces. She had seen her father count and recount those coins when Aldrich placed them on the table, his hands shaking with relief and shame. It was more money than her family had seen at one time in years, enough to buy grain for the winter and perhaps repair the worst of the roof damage. Her parents would live more comfortably because of her sacrifice, and she found she couldn't even hate them for it. The sound of heavy footsteps on the stairs announced Aldrich's arrival. He filled the doorway to her room, his bulk blocking most of the light from below. "Time to go," he said without preamble. "My wagon is waiting at the village edge, and I want to be well away from here before full daylight, before the neighbors could witness her departure and ask uncomfortable questions," he meant. The transaction would be easier for everyone if she simply disappeared, leaving behind only whispered speculation about her fate. She slung the traveling bag over her shoulder and picked up her healing satchel, testing the weight. Everything she owned, everything she was, reduced to 2 simple bundles that barely strained her arms. The irony was not lost on her. She who had spent her life caring for others' possessions and problems, accumulating little for herself beyond knowledge and the worn tools of her trade. Her parents waited by the door, their faces etched with misery and relief in equal measure. Her mother reached out as if to embrace her, then stopped, her arms falling to her sides. "We're sorry, child," her father said quietly. "We truly are, but this is for the best, for all of us." Elin looked at him for a long moment, memorizing the lines of his face, the way his shoulders curved with age and hard labor, the calluses on his hands from a lifetime of work. These people had fed her, clothed her, taught her to read and write when many daughters received no such education. They had also just sold her to a stranger for the price of a decent horse. "I understand," she said, and meant it. Understanding, however, was not the same as forgiveness. The walk through Greyhold's empty streets felt like a funeral procession. Aldrich strode ahead with the confident gait of a man accustomed to getting his way, while Elin followed with her possessions clutched against her chest. A few early risers peered out their windows, their faces curious and quickly hidden when they met her gaze. The merchant's wagon waited at the village boundary, a sturdy construct designed for long travel over rough roads. Iron shackles hung from a ring bolted to the wagon bed, not currently locked around her wrists, but their presence was unmistakable. She was being transported as cargo, not as a passenger. "Climb up!" Aldrich ordered, checking the harness on his 2 sturdy horses. "We have a long day ahead of us, and I want to reach the next village before dark." Elin hesitated at the wagon's edge, looking back at Greyhold one last time. The village spread before her in the growing light, its stone cottages and narrow streets, as familiar as her own heartbeat. Somewhere in those streets, Henrik was probably wondering why she hadn't returned with more willow bark tea. Other patients would be expecting her visits, counting on her healing touch to ease their pain. But she was no longer Greyhold's healer. She was Aldrich's property, bound for an unknown destination and an uncertain fate. The healing satchel across her shoulder felt heavier with that knowledge, weighted down not just with herbs and remedies, but with the loss of everything that had given her life meaning. She climbed into the wagon and settled herself among the merchant's other goods. Bolts of cloth, bags of grain, tools and trinkets meant for trade in distant markets. The irony was complete. She'd become just another item in his inventory, valued for her utility rather than her humanity. Aldrich climbed onto the driver's bench and took up the reins. With a sharp whistle and a slap of leather against horseflesh, the wagon lurched into motion. Elin gripped the side rails as they rumbled away from everything she had ever known, heading toward mountain passes that led to lands she had never seen. Behind them, Greyhold diminished to a collection of small shapes against the mountainside, then disappeared entirely as the road curved around a rocky outcrop. 32 years of life, erased as easily as writing on a slate. The healing satchel pressed against her side, a reminder that some things endured even when everything else was stripped away. But as the wagon carried her deeper into the mountains, toward whatever future Aldrich had purchased for 3 silver coins, Elin wondered if her skills and knowledge would be enough to sustain her in the trials ahead. The road stretched before them, winding through passes she had never traveled, leading to destinations she could not imagine. She was no longer Elin of Greyhold, daughter and healer. She was simply cargo, bound for market in a stranger's wagon, with nothing but her grandmother's tools and her own determination to see her through whatever came next. 3 days into the mountains, King Roan Blackthorn drew his destrier to a halt on the rocky outcrop overlooking the Serpent's Pass. Below him, his company of 40 mounted soldiers waited in disciplined formation, their armor dulled to prevent the gleam of sunlight from announcing their position to any watching eyes. The rebellion in these peaks had been contained, but Roan had learned long ago that contained and crushed were 2 very different things. At 43, the king bore the accumulated weight of 2 decades of warfare etched into every line of his weathered face. Scars traced silver paths through his dark beard, souvenirs from countless battles that had forged his kingdom from a collection of fractious mountain clans. His hands, steady on the reins despite their coating of old sword calluses, wore only one piece of jewelry, a heavy signet ring bearing the wolf crest of House Blackthorn. The ring felt heavier today than usual, weighted down not by gold and precious stones, but by the knowledge of what awaited him back at court. 3 marriage proposals lay on his desk, each one a carefully crafted political alliance designed to strengthen his kingdom's borders or treasury. Lady Cordelia of House Ravencrest, young enough to be his daughter and cunning enough to make his life miserable. The widow Thorn, whose late husband's lands bordered his enemy's territory and whose bed had already been warmed by half his court. And Princess Isadora of Valenhall, whose father controlled the southern trade routes and whose dowry could fund another decade of military campaigns. All 3 were suitable. All 3 were strategic necessities, and all 3 left him feeling like a man drowning in silk and political necessity, trapped in a golden cage of his own making. "Your Majesty," Captain Marcus Torvin rode up beside him, his grizzled face serious beneath his helm. Marcus had served as Rowan's second-in-command for 15 years, earning his position through loyalty and a disturbing ability to anticipate his king's tactical decisions. "The scouts report the pass ahead is clear, but there's a merchant wagon moving slowly up the mountain road. Could be a problem if we need to move quickly." Roan studied the winding path below, his trained eye automatically cataloguing potential ambush points and escape routes. Old habits from his days as a young warrior, when survival depended on such vigilance. Even now, as an established king with a powerful army at his back, He found himself unable to shake the cautious instincts that had kept him alive through countless battles. "What kind of merchant?" he asked, though part of him was already growing weary of the question. Everything in his life seemed to require tactical consideration these days, every decision filtered through the lens of political consequence and strategic advantage. "Aldrich Grimm, according to our sources," Marcus replied, consulting a leather-bound notebook. "Known trader, travels these routes regularly, usually carries textiles and household goods. Not known for political activities, but in these mountains." "You never can tell." Roan nodded absently, his attention caught by movement on the road below. A wagon had indeed appeared around the far bend, moving at the plodding pace of heavily laden draft horses. From this distance he could make out the driver's bulky form and what appeared to be cargo covered by canvas tarps. Nothing unusual about it, except for something that made him pause. There was a figure in the wagon bed who clearly wasn't cargo, a woman, from what he could tell, sitting among the merchant's goods, with the rigid posture of someone trying to maintain dignity in an undignified situation. Even from this height, something about her stillness caught his attention. Not the relaxed ease of a willing passenger, but the careful control of someone enduring rather than traveling. "Marcus," he said slowly, "have the men form up for descent, but keep weapons sheathed. I want to have a word with this merchant." His captain's eyebrows rose slightly. "Sir, the pass ahead is clear, and we could easily overtake them without stopping. There's also no tactical disadvantage to a simple conversation," Roan interrupted. "And I find myself curious about his passenger." It was true, though he couldn't entirely explain why. Perhaps it was the woman's posture, so carefully controlled, despite her obviously uncomfortable circumstances. Perhaps it was the nagging sense that something wasn't quite right about the scene below, or perhaps it was simply that after 3 days of military briefings and political calculations, he craved a moment of human interaction that wasn't filtered through the lens of strategy and power. The company began its descent in good order, horses picking their way carefully down the steep mountain path. Roan had trained them well over the years. They could fight like demons when necessary, but they were equally capable of precision movement when stealth was required. Today called for something in between, enough presence to command respect, but not so much as to appear threatening to a simple merchant. As they drew closer to the wagon, Roan's impression of wrongness only strengthened. The woman in the wagon bed was indeed a passenger, but her placement among the cargo suggested she wasn't there by choice. Her clothes marked her as common-born, but her posture and the intelligence in her eyes spoke of education and self-respect. Most telling were the iron shackles hanging loose from a ring beside her, not currently locked, but clearly intended for her restraint. The merchant had spotted their approach and drawn his wagon to a halt, his weather-beaten face showing the proper mixture of respect and nervousness appropriate to encountering a royal company on a mountain road. He climbed down from his driver's bench with the careful movements of a man who understood the importance of appearing non-threatening to armed soldiers. "Your Majesty," Aldrich said, executing a passable bow despite his obvious discomfort. "An honor to encounter you on these roads. I am Aldrich Grimm, a humble merchant traveling to the eastern settlements with goods for trade." Roan dismounted and approached the wagon, his attention split between the merchant's nervous explanations and the woman who watched the proceedings with steady, intelligent eyes. Up close, she was older than he had first thought, perhaps 30 or more, with the kind of practical beauty that came from competence rather than ornament. Her hands, he noticed, bore the calluses of hard work, but they were clean and steady, the hands of someone accustomed to delicate tasks. "And your passenger?" Roan asked quietly, nodding toward the woman. Aldrich's face flushed slightly. "Ah, that would be Elin, Your Majesty. Recently acquired from her family in Greyhold village." She's bound for service in Lord Harrick's household. He has need of someone with medical knowledge to tend his aging mother, recently acquired. The phrase sat poorly in Roan's mouth, bringing with it the sour taste of human trafficking barely disguised as legitimate commerce. He had encountered such situations before in his campaigns, desperate families selling daughters or sons to merchants who promised good positions but delivered something far different. Medical knowledge. Roan stepped closer to the wagon, studying the woman's face. She met his gaze directly, neither defiant nor submissive, but with the calm attention of someone assessing a potentially dangerous situation. "I am trained in herbal medicine and wound care," Elin said, her voice steady despite her circumstances. "I have served as healer to my village for many years." There was pride in her voice, carefully controlled but unmistakable. This was a woman who knew her worth, even if circumstances had forced her into an undignified position. Roan found himself oddly impressed by her composure. Most people quailed when faced with a king's direct attention, but she seemed to regard him as simply another person to be evaluated and understood. Greyhold village, Roan mused. "I know of it. Remote settlement, hard winters, poor soil. Families there often struggle to support unmarried daughters, particularly those past prime marriage age." The slight tightening around Elin's eyes told him his guess had struck close to the mark. Behind him, he could sense Marcus's growing impatience with this delay, but something about the situation compelled his continued attention. Perhaps it was the contrast between Elin's obvious competence and her current powerless state. Perhaps it was the merchant's nervous energy suggesting this transaction wasn't as straightforward as he claimed. Or perhaps it was the simple fact that she reminded him of himself, someone of evident capability, reduced by circumstances to a position far beneath their true worth. "And you, Master Grimm," Roan said, turning his attention back to the merchant. "What compensation did you provide Elin's family for this arrangement?" Aldrich's discomfort deepened. "A fair price, Your Majesty. 3 silver pieces, which is generous considering her age and unmarried status. Her family was quite grateful for the opportunity to—" 3 silver pieces. Roan's voice carried a dangerous edge that made several of his soldiers shift subtly in their saddles. "For a trained healer, with years of experience, that seems remarkably modest compensation." The merchant began to stammer an explanation, but Roan had already lost interest in his words. 3 silver pieces was barely enough to buy a decent horse, let alone a human being with valuable skills. It spoke of desperation on one side and exploitation on the other, a transaction that left everyone involved diminished except for the merchant who profited from others' misfortune. Behind him, Captain Marcus cleared his throat softly. "Your Majesty, we should consider moving on. The daylight is precious in these mountains." It was true. They had duties waiting, responsibilities that couldn't be postponed for the sake of one wronged woman and a merchant of questionable ethics. Roan had a kingdom to govern, alliances to maintain, enemies to watch. The fate of a village healer, however unjust, was not his primary concern. But as he looked at Elin, sitting with quiet dignity among the merchant's goods, he found himself thinking of his own situation. Soon he would return to court, where he would be expected to choose from among the marriage proposals waiting on his desk. He would select a bride based on political advantage rather than personal preference, entering into a union designed to benefit his kingdom rather than his heart. Just like Elin, he was being sold, though his price was measured in political alliances rather than silver coins, and his cage would be made of silk rather than iron. The parallel struck him with unexpected force, creating a moment of recognition that transcended the differences in their stations. "Tell me, Elin of Greyhold," he said quietly, "are you content with this arrangement?" Her eyes met his again, and in them he saw a flash of something that might have been hope, quickly suppressed by hard-learned pragmatism. "Content is, perhaps, too strong a word, Your Majesty," she replied with careful honesty, "but I understand the necessities that led to it." Understanding was not the same as acceptance, and both of them knew it. Roan found himself at a crossroads, faced with a decision that would ripple outward in ways he couldn't predict. He could allow the merchant to continue on his way, delivering Elin to whatever fate awaited her in Lord Harwick's household. It was the prudent choice, the politically safe decision that would avoid complications and maintain the status quo. But as he looked into Elin's steady gaze, Roan felt something stir within him that had been dormant for years, the capacity for spontaneous action based on conviction rather than calculation. Here was a woman of obvious competence and dignity, reduced to chattel through circumstances beyond her control, facing an uncertain future that would likely waste her considerable abilities. More than that, he recognized in her situation a mirror of his own constraints. Both of them were being valued for their utility rather than their character, both trapped by others' definitions of worth, both facing futures determined by political necessity rather than personal choice. The moment stretched between them, heavy with possibility and fraught with consequences. Behind him, Marcus shifted restlessly in his saddle, clearly eager to continue their mission. The daylight was indeed precious in these mountains, and they had responsibilities that couldn't be indefinitely postponed. But sometimes, Roan reflected, the most important decisions were the ones that couldn't be justified through logical analysis, the choices that arose from fundamental recognition of what was right rather than what was expedient. The moment stretched between them, like a bowstring drawn taut. Roan saw something in Elin's eyes that made his decision for him, a flicker of recognition, as if she too understood that they were kindred spirits, trapped by circumstances beyond their control. Without fully realizing what he was doing, he stepped closer to the wagon and extended his hand toward her. "Elin of Greyhold," he said, his voice carrying the formal weight of royal proclamation, "I have need of a healer in my service. Would you accept a position in my household?" The merchant's face went pale. "Your Majesty, surely you understand that this woman is bound for Lord Harwick's service. The arrangement has already been made, payment rendered." "Payment to her family, not to her," Roan said, without taking his eyes off Elin. "And I believe my household's need supersedes Lord Harwick's. What compensation did you say you provided her family?" 3 silver pieces, Your Majesty, but Roan reached for his purse and counted out 6 silver coins, letting them fall into Aldrich's trembling hands. "Then consider the arrangement transferred to my service, with compensation doubled for your trouble." It was an impulsive decision, one that would undoubtedly create complications when word reached his court. But as Elin accepted his outstretched hand and allowed him to help her down from the wagon, Roan felt something shift inside him, a sense of rightness that he hadn't experienced in years of calculated political maneuvering. Her hand was warm and steady in his, calloused from years of healing work, but soft enough to remind him that she was still fundamentally gentle despite her strength. When her feet touched the ground, she stood before him with quiet dignity, still uncertain, but no longer defeated. "I accept your offer, Your Majesty," she said simply. Behind them, Captain Marcus was making subtle signals to the other soldiers, clearly trying to determine whether his king had lost his mind or was operating according to some strategic plan beyond their understanding. Roan couldn't blame his confusion. He wasn't entirely certain himself what had prompted this sudden action. "Marcus," he called over his shoulder, "see that the lady has a proper horse. She'll be traveling with us from here." "Your Majesty," Marcus approached with the careful demeanor of a man walking on thin ice. "Perhaps we should discuss the implications of this decision. Lord Harwick may take offense at having his arrangements disrupted, and the court will adapt," Roan said firmly, "as they always do." Aldrich was still staring at the silver coins in his palm, as if he couldn't quite believe his fortune. 6 silver pieces represented a significant profit on his 3 silver investment. But Roan could see the calculation in the merchant's eyes as he considered whether to press for even more compensation. Your Majesty is most generous, Aldrich said carefully, though I wonder if perhaps some additional consideration might be appropriate, given the disruption to my carefully laid plans. The consideration you've received is more than fair. Roan's voice carried a note of steel that made the merchant step back hastily. I suggest you accept it graciously and continue on your way. Elin had been listening to this exchange with an expression of growing amazement, as if she couldn't quite believe that her circumstances had changed so dramatically in the space of a few minutes. She still carried her traveling bag and her healing satchel, the sum total of her worldly possessions, but her posture had already begun to shift from resignation to something approaching hope. Your Majesty, she said quietly, I should mention that I have no experience serving in royal households. My skills are those of a village healer. I know herbs and basic medicine, but I am not trained in court protocols. Can be learned, Roan interrupted. Healing skills and honest character are far more valuable and much harder to find. One of his soldiers had brought forward a gentle mare, saddled and ready for travel. Elin approached the horse with the easy confidence of someone familiar with animals, running her hand along the mare's neck and murmuring soft words before accepting the soldier's assistance in mounting. She sat the horse well, Roan noticed, with the natural seat of someone who had grown up around working animals, even if she lacked formal riding instruction. Everything about her spoke of competence and adaptability, qualities that would serve her well in the challenges ahead. Because there would certainly be challenges. By taking Elin under his protection, Roan had created a situation that would require careful navigation. His court was already buzzing with speculation about his delayed choice of a bride, and introducing an unknown woman into his household would only intensify that speculation. Some would assume she was intended as a mistress. Others would wonder if she represented some kind of political alliance they hadn't anticipated. But as they formed up to continue their journey, Roan found himself oddly unconcerned about those future complications. For the first time in months, he had acted according to his own conscience rather than political calculation, and the freedom of that choice felt intoxicating. "Tell me about your healing training," he said as they began to ride side by side along the mountain path. Behind them, his soldiers maintained their disciplined formation, though he could sense their curious attention to this unexpected addition to their company. "My grandmother taught me," Elin replied, settling into the mare's steady rhythm. "She learned from her mother, who learned from hers. The knowledge has been passed down through the women of my family for generations. I know which herbs ease pain, which ones fight infection, how to set broken bones and stitch wounds cleanly. And you've used these skills in practice. For 15 years, I've been the primary healer for Greyhold and the surrounding settlements. I've delivered babies, treated fevers, tended injuries from farm accidents and hunting mishaps. I've never lost a patient to infection, and only twice to injuries too severe for my skills to address." There was quiet pride in her voice, the satisfaction of someone who knew their worth, regardless of how others might value them. Roan found himself thinking of his own skills, the strategic mind that had won him battles, the leadership abilities that had united fractious clans, the diplomatic cunning that had secured his borders. Like Elin, he knew his own value, but unlike her, he had always had the power to ensure others recognized it as well. "Your village was fortunate to have you," he said. A shadow crossed her features. They didn't see it that way in the end. "My healing skills were valued, but my other failures—" She stopped, seeming to realize she was sharing more than wisdom would dictate with a virtual stranger, even one who happened to be a king. "Your marriage," Roan said gently. "The lack of children." She nodded, looking ahead to the winding mountain path rather than meeting his eyes. "In Greyhold, a woman's worth is measured primarily by her ability to bear sons. My other contributions were appreciated, but considered secondary to that fundamental failure." The bitterness in her voice was carefully controlled, but Roan could hear it nonetheless. He understood that particular pain, the reduction of a complex human being to a single function, the dismissal of genuine accomplishments in favor of some arbitrary measure of success. And yet, he said thoughtfully, you speak of it as your failure rather than a simple matter of circumstance beyond anyone's control. Elin glanced at him with surprise, as if the thought hadn't occurred to her before. Isn't it? If I had been able to give my husband the sons he wanted, if I had fulfilled my basic purpose as a wife, then you would still be living in Greyhold, your considerable skills wasted on minor ailments, your potential constrained by the narrow expectations of people who couldn't see beyond their own limited understanding. The words surprised him even as he spoke them. He hadn't intended to offer philosophy along with rescue, but something about Elin's quiet acceptance of blame for circumstances beyond her control stirred his own frustrations with the constraints placed upon them both. You see it as liberation, she said with a slight smile. I confess I hadn't considered that perspective. Sometimes the things that seem like endings are actually beginnings in disguise. Your parents' decision to sell you may have been the very thing that freed you to discover what you're truly capable of achieving. They rode in comfortable silence for a while, the mountain landscape unfolding around them in shades of green and grey stone. Roan found himself studying Elin from the corner of his eye, noting the way she observed their surroundings with intelligent attention, cataloguing plants and terrain features with the trained eye of someone accustomed to finding useful resources. Wherever she went, Your Majesty, she said eventually, may I ask what prompted you to intervene in my situation? Surely a king has more pressing concerns than the fate of one displaced village healer. It was a fair question, and one he wasn't certain he could answer completely honestly. How could he explain the moment of recognition when he saw her sitting with dignity intact despite her degraded circumstances? How could he describe the sudden understanding that they were both prisoners of others' expectations, both valued for functions they were expected to perform rather than for who they truly were? Perhaps I saw something in you that reminded me of myself, he said finally. Someone whose true worth has been overlooked by people too focused on narrow measures of success. She considered this for a moment, her expression thoughtful. And what narrow measures constrain a king? The question was bold, almost presumptuous, but asked with genuine curiosity rather than impertinence. Roan found himself appreciating her directness. It had been years since anyone had spoken to him without the careful deference that made honest conversation nearly impossible. Marriage alliances, he said simply, trade agreements, military campaigns, every decision filtered through questions of political advantage rather than personal preference. I haven't made a truly spontaneous choice in years, until today. And rescuing me was a spontaneous choice, completely. My advisors would be horrified if they knew how little strategic thinking went into the decision. Elin laughed, a genuine sound of amusement that seemed to surprise them both. When had he last heard honest laughter from someone who wasn't calculating the political implications of their mirth? Then perhaps we're both benefiting from this arrangement, she said. You've gained a healer, and I've gained evidence that spontaneous choices can sometimes work out well. As they continued up the mountain path toward his temporary headquarters, Roan reflected on the truth of her words. For the first time in months, he felt like himself rather than a collection of royal duties and political obligations. It was a dangerous feeling, this sense of personal freedom, but also intoxicating. Behind them, the merchant's wagon had already disappeared around a distant bend, carrying Aldrich toward whatever new schemes awaited him in the eastern settlements. But Roan found his attention focused entirely forward on the path ahead, and the woman riding beside him, whose presence had somehow shifted his entire perspective on the choices available to a king. The late afternoon sun was beginning to angle low through the mountain peaks, casting long shadows across their route. Soon they would reach his encampment, where explanations would be required and complications would begin. But for these remaining hours of travel, Roan allowed himself to simply enjoy the unprecedented experience of making a decision based on instinct rather than strategy, and finding that it felt remarkably like the beginning of something important. The royal encampment sprawled across a mountain meadow like a temporary city, its ordered rows of tents and carefully planned logistics speaking to the military precision that had made Roan's campaigns legendary throughout the region. Cookfires sent thin columns of smoke into the evening air, and the sound of men preparing for another night in the field created a low hum of activity that was both purposeful and oddly comforting. Elin had never seen anything like it. Her entire village of Greyhold could have fit into one corner of this organized chaos, and the sheer number of soldiers, horses, and support personnel moving through the camp with practiced efficiency was overwhelming. Yet as intimidating as it all appeared, she found herself noticing the signs of good leadership. The men looked well-fed and properly equipped, their weapons were clean and maintained, and despite the casual discipline of a seasoned army, there was an underlying current of respect for their commander that spoke well of Roan's character as a leader. "Impressive, isn't it?" Roan said, noticing her wide-eyed survey of the camp. 200 men, all the supplies needed to sustain them in the field, and the administrative apparatus required to coordinate military operations across 3 mountain provinces. "Sometimes I think running a kingdom is less complex than running an army." Captain Marcus had ridden ahead to announce their arrival, and Elin could see the ripple of attention their approach was creating throughout the camp. Soldiers paused in their evening tasks to watch the king return, but their curious gazes lingered on her, the unexpected addition to their company who clearly didn't fit any of their familiar categories. A young soldier hurried forward to take their horses, executing a crisp salute before carefully helping Elin dismount. She thanked him quietly, noting how his eyes avoided direct contact, not from disrespect, but from uncertainty about how to properly address a woman under the king's protection whose status remained undefined. "Your Majesty," a voice called from the direction of the largest tent. A tall, lean man emerged from the canvas structure, his graying hair and confident bearing marking him as someone of importance in the camp's hierarchy. "Captain Marcus informed me of your return and of our unexpected guest." Roan's expression shifted subtly, taking on the formal demeanor that Elin was beginning to recognize as his public face. "Sir Geoffrey, may I present Elin of Greyhold, who has agreed to serve as healer to our company. Elin, this is Sir Geoffrey Ashford, my chief administrator, and the man responsible for ensuring this army doesn't starve or freeze in these mountains." Sir Geoffrey executed a perfect bow, though Elin caught the slight narrowing of his eyes that suggested he was rapidly calculating the implications of her presence. "An honor, my lady. We are indeed fortunate to have skilled medical assistance available." The title was diplomatically chosen, neither high enough to suggest royal favor, nor low enough to insult someone under the king's protection. Elin appreciated the careful courtesy, even as she recognized the assessment taking place behind Sir Geoffrey's polite smile. "I am honored to serve," she replied simply, allowing her own experience with village politics to guide her response. "I hope my skills will prove useful to your men." "I'm certain they will," Sir Geoffrey said smoothly. "Perhaps you would allow me to show you to appropriate quarters while His Majesty attends to the evening briefing." It was clearly a diplomatic separation, an opportunity for the king's advisors to discuss this unexpected development without her presence complicating their conversations. Elin nodded her acceptance, recognizing both the practical necessity and the underlying message that she remained an outsider whose status had yet to be determined. Racine seemed to understand the subtext as well. "See that she's provided with everything she needs," he said to Sir Geoffrey, his tone carrying enough authority to make it clear that her comfort was not a trivial concern. "We'll speak more in the morning when the evening's business is concluded." As Sir Geoffrey led her away from the central area of the camp, Elin caught glimpses of the conversations beginning around the command tent. Groups of officers and advisors were gathering with the quick efficiency of men accustomed to important decisions, their voices carrying the serious tones of political discussion. She wondered what they were saying about her unexpected appearance, what theories they were developing about her relationship to their king, what complications they foresaw arising from this impulsive rescue. "The king's tent is there," Sir Geoffrey said, pointing to a large pavilion set slightly apart from the others. "Your quarters have been prepared in the adjacent structure, close enough to be available if medical services are needed, but providing appropriate privacy for a lady." The tent he indicated was smaller, but well appointed, with a proper bed, washing facilities, and even a small table that could serve as a workspace. Someone had already placed her traveling bag and healing satchel inside, along with additional supplies that suggested careful attention to her potential needs. "This is very generous," Elin said, running her hand over the smooth wooden surface of the table. "I'm accustomed to much simpler accommodations." "His Majesty's instructions were quite specific regarding your comfort," Sir Geoffrey replied, "though I confess your arrival has created something of a stir among the men. We don't often travel with female companionship, and there's been considerable speculation about your role in our company." The warning was delicately delivered, but unmistakable. Her presence was already generating attention and gossip that could create complications for both herself and Rowan. In a closed community like a military camp, rumors could take on lives of their own, growing and distorting until they bore little resemblance to reality. "I understand," Elin said carefully. "I hope my conduct will prove that their king's judgment in offering me a position was sound." Sir Geoffrey studied her for a moment, his experienced eyes reading her character with the same precision he probably applied to logistical challenges. "I believe it will," he said finally. "You strike me as a woman of practical sense, a valuable quality in our current circumstances." After he left, Elin sat on the edge of her new bed and tried to process the extraordinary changes that had transformed her life in the space of a single day. This morning, she had awakened as a piece of human cargo bound for an uncertain fate in a stranger's household. Tonight she was a guest in the king's own encampment, protected by royal authority and provided with comforts she had never imagined. Yet she was also acutely aware of how precarious her position remained. She was here at Rowan's whim, dependent on his continued protection and favor. If his advisors convinced him that her presence was more trouble than her skills were worth, she could find herself cast out just as suddenly as she had been rescued. The sound of voices from the command tent carried clearly through the evening air, and though she couldn't make out specific words, the tone suggested heated discussion. She suspected she was the subject of at least some of that debate, a complication that had been introduced into their carefully planned campaign without adequate consideration of the consequences. A soft scratch at her tent flap interrupted her brooding. At her invitation, a young woman entered carrying a tray of food and a pitcher of clean water. "Begging your pardon, my lady," the woman said with a shy curtsy. "I'm Maren, and I help with the camp, cooking and mending. Sir Geoffrey thought you might be hungry after your journey." Maren was perhaps 20, with the practical dress and capable hands of someone accustomed to hard work. Her presence raised interesting questions about the camp's composition. Elin had assumed it was an all-male environment, but clearly some support personnel included women. "Thank you, Maren," Elin said, accepting the tray gratefully. "I confess, I hadn't realized how hungry traveling could make one. Are there many women in the camp?" "A few, my lady. Mostly washerwomen and cooks, some wives who follow their husbands on campaign. But none quite like yourself, if you don't mind my saying." The comment was innocent enough, but it reinforced Elin's awareness of her unique position. She was neither servant nor noble, neither wife nor mistress, but something altogether undefined that would require careful navigation to avoid creating problems for everyone involved. "What are the men saying about my arrival?" she asked, deciding. That direct information was preferable to ignorant speculation. Maren glanced around nervously, as if worried about being overheard. "Some think you're meant to be the king's new bride," she whispered. "Others figure you for a spy or a political hostage. A few of the older soldiers think you might be a hedge witch, brought in to cast spells for victory in battle." Elin almost smiled at the variety of theories. Each one reflected the men's attempt to fit her into a familiar category, to make sense of an anomaly that didn't match their previous experience. None of them had apparently considered the simple truth that she was exactly what Roan had claimed, a healer whose skills might prove useful to their campaign. "And what do you think?" Elin asked. Marin's young face showed surprising wisdom. "I think the king saw something in you that he needed. And I think you're probably exactly what you appear to be, a good woman trying to make the best of difficult circumstances." It was a perceptive assessment, and one that gave Elin hope that not everyone in the camp would view her with suspicion. If she could win the trust of people like Maren, the soldiers might eventually accept her presence as beneficial rather than disruptive. "I hope you're right," Elin said, "and I hope I can prove worthy of the opportunity I've been given." After Maren left, Elin unpacked her few belongings and tried to establish some sense of normalcy in her temporary home. She arranged her healing supplies on the small table, organizing them according to the system her grandmother had taught her: pain relief herbs in one group, infection-fighting preparations in another, general tonics and strengthening compounds in a third. The familiar ritual of organizing her tools helped calm her mind and reminded her of who she was, beneath all the uncertainty of her current situation. Whatever else might be in doubt, she remained a healer, someone whose knowledge and skills could ease suffering and preserve life. That identity was solid ground in a world that had suddenly become foreign and unpredictable. Through the tent walls, she could still hear the murmur of voices from the command area, though the tone had shifted from heated debate to more measured discussion. Whatever arguments had been raised about her presence, it seemed they were being resolved through the practical consideration of logistics and strategy rather than emotional reaction. As the evening deepened and the camp settled into its nighttime routine, Elin found herself reflecting on the strange series of events that had brought her to this place. This morning, she had been a piece of cargo, valued at 3 silver coins. Tonight, she was under the protection of a king, provided with comfort and safety she had never experienced. But more than that, she was beginning to understand that her rescue had been as much about Rowan's needs as her own. In her, he had found someone whose circumstances mirrored his own, someone trapped by others' expectations, valued for function rather than character, constrained by definitions that failed to capture their true worth. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new complications to navigate and new relationships to build. But tonight, for the first time in years, Elin fell asleep feeling that her future held genuine possibility rather than mere endurance. The change was as unexpected as it was welcome, a gift she hadn't known enough to hope for until it was placed. In her hands, Elin awakened before dawn to the sound of purposeful activity throughout the camp. Through her tent walls, she could hear the muted conversations of men beginning their daily routines, the soft nickering of horses, and the distant clatter of cooking implements as the camp's kitchens prepared the morning meal. It was a foreign but oddly comforting soundscape, the noise of organized community rather than the isolated silence she had grown accustomed to in her final days at Greyhold. She dressed quickly in one of her 2 remaining good dresses, arranging a healing satchel across her shoulder before stepping out into the crisp mountain air. The encampment was bathed in the grey light of early morning, and she could see soldiers moving through their established routines with the efficiency of long practice. Some tended to their equipment, others saw to the horses, and a few gathered around cookfires for warmth and early conversation. "You're an early riser," a familiar voice said behind her. She turned to find Roan emerging from his own tent, dressed in practical traveling clothes rather than the formal attire she might have expected from a king. He looked more rested than she had seen him the previous day, as if a good night's sleep in familiar surroundings had restored his natural confidence. "Old habits," Elin replied. "In Greyhold, the day began before sunrise, and those who rose late found themselves behind in tasks that couldn't wait for convenience." Rowan nodded approvingly. "A practical attitude. I've found that early mornings often provide the clearest thinking and the most honest conversations. Walk with me. I'd like to show you something." He led her toward the edge of the camp, where the organized activity gave way to the wild mountain landscape beyond. A small stream ran along the meadow's border, its clear water reflecting the gradually lightening sky. The sound of running water created a natural privacy barrier, allowing conversation without the risk of being overheard by curious soldiers. "How did you find your first night as a guest of the Royal Army?" Rowan asked, as they settled on a fallen log beside the stream. "Comfortable. Beyond anything I expected," Elin admitted. "Though I suspect my arrival created some discussion among your advisors." Rowan's expression grew rueful. "More than some. Sir Geoffrey spent a considerable portion of the evening explaining why bringing an unknown woman into our company could create complications, ranging from simple gossip to questions about my fitness for kingship." The honesty surprised her. She had expected diplomatic reassurances, not frank acknowledgement of the problems her presence might cause. "And what did you tell him?" "That complications arise from avoiding necessary actions just as often as from taking them. You're here because you have skills we can use, and because the alternative, allowing you to be sold into whatever servitude awaited you, was unacceptable to my conscience." There was something deeper in his voice, a note of personal conviction that suggested this decision meant more to him than simple humanitarian concern. Elin studied his profile as he gazed across the stream, noting the lines of fatigue around. His eyes that spoke of more than just the physical demands of military campaigning. "Tell me about these marriage proposals waiting for you at court," she said quietly. The question seemed to surprise him, though he didn't ask how she had learned of them. "3 offers, each one carefully calculated to advance my kingdom's interests. Lady Cordelia would bring alliance with the northern clans. The Widow Thorn controls strategic territory along our eastern border, and Princess Isadora represents access to southern trade routes. And none of them appeal to you personally. Personal appeal isn't supposed to be a consideration for kings. Marriage is diplomacy by other means, alliance building disguised as romance. My desires and preferences are secondary to my kingdom's needs." Elin heard the resignation in his voice, the weary acceptance of duty over inclination that she recognized from her own experience with unwanted obligations. "Is that why you rescued me? Because you saw someone else being forced into an arrangement that served others' interests rather than her own?" Rowan was quiet for a long moment, watching the stream flow past them toward distant valleys they couldn't see. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a vulnerability she hadn't heard before. "Perhaps," he said, "or perhaps I saw an opportunity to make one decision based on instinct rather than calculation. Do you know how long it's been since I acted spontaneously without considering the political implications of every choice? Years, I would guess. Nearly a decade. Every decision filtered through councils and advisors, every impulse measured against strategic objectives. I had forgotten what it felt like to simply see something wrong and try to correct it. The morning light was growing stronger, revealing the camp in greater detail as the soldiers continued their preparations for another day. Elin could see several men glancing in their direction, their curiosity about her relationship with their king evident even from this distance. "They're wondering what we're discussing," she observed. "They're wondering if you're my new mistress, my secret bride, or a political hostage whose significance they haven't yet grasped," Rowan replied with dry humor. "Military camps are notorious breeding grounds for speculation, and which theory would create the fewest complications? None of them, unfortunately. Any woman traveling under my protection is going to generate attention, and attention leads to questions that could prove embarrassing when they reach the royal court. Elin considered this, weighing the implications of her continued presence against the alternatives available to her. I could leave, she said carefully, find some other situation that wouldn't create problems for your kingship. Is that what you want? The question was asked without pressure, but she could sense the importance he attached to her answer. He had offered her protection and opportunity, but he wouldn't force her to accept them if she chose a different path. No, she said honestly. For the first time in years, I feel as though I might have the chance to be valued for what I can contribute rather than blamed for what I cannot provide. That's worth navigating some complications. Rowan smiled, a genuine expression of pleasure that transformed his entire face. Then we'll navigate them together, though I should warn you that court life will present challenges that make military. Camp gossip seems simple by comparison. Court life, eventually, yes. This campaign will end, and when it does, I'll be expected to return to the capital and make my choice among those marriage proposals. You'll need to be prepared for an environment where every word and gesture is analyzed for hidden meaning. The prospect was intimidating, but also oddly exciting. Elin had never imagined she might see the royal court, much less participate in its complex social dynamics. It would be a test of skills she had never developed, requiring her to navigate political currents far more treacherous than anything she had encountered in village life. What would my role be in such an environment? She asked. Officially, royal. Healer, responsible for the health and medical needs of the court. Unofficially, Rowan paused, seeming to consider his words carefully. Someone whose counsel I value, whose presence reminds me that there are perspectives beyond political calculation. The implication hung between them, unspoken but understood. He was offering her more than employment. He was suggesting a partnership of sorts, a relationship that would provide her with security and purpose while giving him access to honest advice from someone not invested in court politics. It would be an honor, she said simply. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the stream flow past and listening to the gradually increasing activity from the camp behind them. The sun was beginning to clear the mountain peaks, casting long shadows across the meadow and warming the air enough to make the morning pleasant rather than merely tolerable. Your Majesty, a voice called from the direction of the camp. Captain Marcus approached with the measured stride of someone, bringing important news. The morning scouts have returned with reports from the eastern settlements. Rowan rose from the log, his demeanor shifting subtly as he resumed his role as military commander. What word do they bring? The situation in Millhaven has deteriorated, Marcus reported, his weathered face grim. The local garrison reports increasing unrest, and there are rumors of organized resistance gathering in the mountain caves above the settlement. Elin could see the change that came over Rowan as he processed this information. The straightening of his shoulders, the sharpening of his focus, the transformation from a man enjoying a peaceful morning conversation to a king facing strategic challenges. How many men does the local garrison have? Rowan asked. 30, sir, but they're green troops with limited mountain warfare experience. If the resistance has been recruiting from the local population, they could be facing odds of 2 or 3 to 1. Then we move toward Millhaven today. How long to break camp and march? 2 hours, Your Majesty, if we travel light and leave the heavier supply wagons to follow. Rowan nodded, already calculating logistics and timing in his mind. Make the arrangements. We'll want to reach the settlement before any organized attack can develop. As Marcus strode away to implement the orders, Rowan turned back to Elin with an expression that mixed apology with determination. I'm afraid our peaceful morning has come to an end. Are you prepared to see what a military campaign actually involves? I've never traveled with an army before, Elin admitted, but I've dealt with injured men and emergency situations. I suspect my skills will be more useful than my inexperience will be harmful. I hope you're right. Because if the reports from Millhaven are accurate, we may be riding into a situation where those healing skills will be desperately needed. The prospect of treating battle injuries was sobering, but also oddly reassuring. Whatever complications her presence might create in terms of court politics or military protocol, her medical knowledge represented genuine value that no one could question. In a world where her worth had been measured by her ability to bear children, the opportunity to be valued for skills she actually possessed felt like a kind of liberation. As they walked back toward the camp, now bustling with the organized chaos of an army preparing to march, Elin reflected on how much her life had changed in less than 24 hours. Yesterday she had been cargo. Today she was a valued member of a royal expedition heading into potential danger. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure, the complete opposite of the predictable despair that had characterized her final days in Greyhold. Whatever lay ahead in Millhaven, whatever challenges awaited her in the royal court, whatever complications arose from her unexplained presence at the king's side, she was finally moving forward rather than simply enduring. The morning sun climbed higher over the mountain peaks, burning away the last traces of dawn mist and revealing the path ahead with crystalline clarity. Soon they would be riding toward an uncertain confrontation, carrying with them all the hopes and fears that accompanied any military venture. But for now, Elin allowed herself a moment of gratitude for the unexpected turn her life had taken. She was no longer a burden to be disposed of or a failure to be hidden away. She was a healer, riding with a king toward whatever destiny awaited them both in the mountains ahead. The messenger arrived at their temporary camp outside Millhaven, just as the evening meal was being distributed to the troops. He was a young man, barely out of his teens, with the distinctive livery of the royal court and the hollow-eyed exhaustion of someone who had ridden hard for days without proper rest. His horse was lathered with sweat despite the cool mountain air, and his hands shook as he dismounted and approached the command tent where Roan was consulting with his officers about the next day's operations. Elin watched from her position near the medical supplies, where she had been preparing bandages and organizing her herbs in anticipation of the injuries that might result from their intervention in Millhaven's troubles. The messenger's arrival sent a ripple of attention through the camp. Communications from the capital were always significant, but the urgency of this particular delivery suggested news of more than routine importance. "Your Majesty," the messenger gasped, executing a hasty bow before pulling a sealed letter from his saddlebag. "Urgent dispatches from the royal court. I was instructed to deliver these to you personally, regardless of circumstances." Roan accepted the letter, noting the heavy wax seal that marked it as coming from his chief advisor, Lord Chancellor Blackwood. The fact that Blackwood had sent a personal messenger rather than using normal diplomatic channels was itself a warning that something significant had developed in the capital. "Captain Marcus," Roan called, "see that this man receives food and rest, and have his horse tended to properly. He's clearly been pushed to the limit." As the messenger was led away to be cared for, Roan broke the seal and began to read. Elin could see his expression change as he processed the contents, his face growing progressively more grim with each line. By the time he finished reading, his jaw was clenched tight enough to make the muscles stand out beneath his beard. "Sir Geoffrey," he said quietly, his voice carrying an edge that made several nearby soldiers look up from their evening meals. "Assemble the senior staff. We need to discuss these developments immediately." Within minutes, the command tent was filled with Roan's most trusted advisors, Captain Marcus, Sir Geoffrey, and the handful of other officers whose judgment and loyalty had been proven through years of campaigning. Elin remained outside, but close enough to the tent's entrance that she could hear the low murmur of voices as Roan shared whatever news the messenger had brought. "This explains much about the timing of these mountain uprisings," she heard Sir Geoffrey say, his cultured voice carrying clearly through the canvas walls. If Lord Ravencrest has been orchestrating these conflicts, then we've been dancing to his tune from the beginning. Captain Marcus interrupted, his tone darkly angry. Every response we've made has played into his larger strategy. Elin felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. She was hearing fragments of a conversation that revealed her rescue and Rowan's current campaign in an entirely new light. Not as isolated incidents, but as pieces of a larger political chess game being played at the highest levels of the kingdom. The question now, Rowan's voice said with forced calm, is whether we can turn this knowledge to our advantage, or whether the trap has already closed around us. Sir, another voice interjected, one of the junior officers whose name Elin hadn't yet learned. What about the woman? If Lord Ravencrest's people have been watching your movements, her presence here could be seen as evidence of the very unfitness for rule they're trying to establish. The words hit Elin like a physical blow. Suddenly, the fragmented conversations she had been hearing began to form a coherent picture, one in which her rescue had not been the spontaneous act of compassion she had believed, but rather an impulsive decision that could be used as a weapon against the man who had saved her. Explain that concern more fully, Rowan said, his voice dangerously quiet. Your Majesty, the officer continued, clearly uncomfortable but determined to speak his piece, if the court faction opposing your rule can present evidence that you've been traveling with an unmarried woman of questionable background, particularly while marriage negotiations with legitimate noble houses are pending, they can claim that I'm unfit for kingship due to moral failings and poor judgment, Rowan finished. Yes, I see the implications. Elin's hands clenched involuntarily around the bandages she had been preparing. She was not just a complication to be managed. She was a weapon that could be used against Rowan by his enemies. Her very presence in his company, which had felt like salvation to her, might prove to be his downfall. There are ways to mitigate the damage, Sir Geoffrey's voice suggested carefully. If the lady could be relocated to a position that provides suitable distance, you mean if she could be disposed of quietly, in a way that removes her as a political liability, Rowan said with bitter clarity. The silence that followed was deafening. Elin could imagine the uncomfortable expressions on the faces of men who had to balance their loyalty to their king with their understanding of political reality. She was a problem that needed solving, and the most obvious solution was her removal from the equation entirely. She found herself thinking of the blood-stained letter that had apparently revealed the true nature of the conspiracy surrounding Rowan's rule. Whatever Lord Ravencrest's ultimate goal, he had clearly been successful in maneuvering Rowan into a position where every choice carried unacceptable consequences. Sir, Captain Marcus said finally, perhaps we should consider what the lady herself thinks about these developments. She's shown remarkable good sense thus far. She might have insights into solutions that wouldn't occur to us. The suggestion surprised Elin almost as much as it seemed to surprise the others in the tent. Marcus was proposing that she be treated as a participant in these discussions rather than simply an object to be manipulated for political convenience. An interesting suggestion, Rowan said thoughtfully. Elin, would you join us? I suspect you've heard enough of this conversation to understand the general situation. She entered the command tent to find 7 pairs of eyes focused on her with varying degrees of curiosity, concern, and calculation. The blood-stained letter lay open on their campaign table, its contents partially visible, though she couldn't read the specific words from her position. Please, Rowan gestured to an empty chair, sit. You deserve to understand how your situation has become entangled with larger political machinations. As she settled into the offered chair, Rowan quickly summarized what the letter had revealed. Lord Ravencrest, one of the most powerful nobles in the kingdom, had been secretly funding and organizing the mountain rebellions that had kept Rowan away from court for months. The goal was not just to create military problems, but to demonstrate that the king was ineffective at maintaining order in his own realm. But more than that, Roan continued, the letter suggests that Ravencrest has been gathering intelligence about my activities during this campaign. Every decision I've made, every move I've ordered, has probably been reported back to him within days, including my rescue, Elin said quietly, understanding the full implications, which means he now has evidence that you've been traveling with an unmarried woman while marriage negotiations are pending. Precisely, and that evidence can be used to support claims that I lack the moral judgment and political wisdom necessary for effective rule. Elin studied the faces around the table, reading the mix of loyalty and pragmatism that characterized Rowan's inner circle. These were good men who genuinely cared about their king's welfare, but they were also experienced enough to recognize a potentially fatal political mistake when they saw one. "What are my options?" she asked directly. Sir Geoffrey cleared his throat diplomatically. "There are several possibilities that might minimize the political damage. A position in a remote location, perhaps, or you could marry me." The words came from Rowan so quietly that for a moment Elin wasn't certain she had heard them correctly. The silence that followed was so complete that she could hear the crackling of the brazier in the corner of the tent. "Your Majesty, sir," Geoffrey said carefully, "while such a solution would certainly address the moral implications of your traveling companionship, it might create even larger political problems. The noble houses expecting marriage alliances would be furious." Rowan acknowledged, but they would be dealing with an accomplished fact rather than a scandal they could exploit. "And it would demonstrate that my personal choices are made for reasons of genuine affection rather than political calculation." Captain Marcus leaned forward, his weathered face thoughtful. "It's bold, sir, risky as hell, but bold. And it would certainly catch Ravencrest off guard. He's probably expecting us to try to hide the lady's existence, not celebrate it." Elin felt as though the world had shifted beneath her feet. This morning, she had been a displaced healer, trying to find her place in a military campaign. Tonight, she was being offered marriage to a king as a political strategy to outmaneuver his enemies. "And what do you think of this proposal?" Rowan asked her directly, his eyes serious, but not unkind. "I won't pretend it's being offered under romantic circumstances, but it would provide you with permanent security and a position that no one could question." She looked around the table at the faces watching her, understanding that her answer would affect not just her own fate, but the political stability of an entire kingdom. The irony was bitter. Having been sold once for being unmarried and childless, she was now being offered the highest marriage in the land for essentially the same reasons. "I need to understand what such a marriage would mean," she said carefully. "In practical terms, beyond the political implications." "It would mean you become queen," Rowan replied simply, "with all the responsibilities and protections that title provides. It would also mean our relationship becomes a matter of public record, subject to scrutiny and criticism from those who oppose our union." "And children?" The question came out before she could stop it, carrying all the weight of her previous marriage's failure. Rowan's expression softened slightly. "Would be welcomed if they came, but would not be the primary purpose of our union. I've learned to value compatibility and mutual respect above dynastic considerations." It was more honesty than she had expected, and more consideration than most royal marriages received. The practical advantages were obvious: security, position, protection from those who might still see her as dispensable cargo. But beyond that, she was being offered partnership with a man she had come to respect and trust, even in the brief time she had known him. "If I agree," she said slowly, "how would such a ceremony take place? We're in the middle of a military campaign, far from any proper church or witnesses of appropriate rank. Military chaplains have the authority to perform marriages," Sir Geoffrey said, warming to the tactical possibilities. And if we announce the union immediately after the ceremony, with proper documentation sent to all the noble houses simultaneously, they'll be faced with a fait accompli that's difficult to challenge. Directly, Captain Marcus finished. Clever. It forces them to react to our move instead of letting them dictate the terms of engagement. Elin realized that despite the extraordinary nature of the proposal, it was being discussed with the same strategic precision that characterized all of Roan's military decisions. She was being offered a role in a carefully orchestrated political maneuver, but one that would transform her from a liability into an asset, from a problem to be solved into a solution to be implemented. There is one other consideration, she said quietly. If Lord Ravencrest has been monitoring your activities, he probably knows about the circumstances of my rescue. My background, being sold by my parents, traveling with a merchant, might be used to argue that you've made an unsuitable choice. Let him make that argument, Roan said, with steel in his voice. I'll be happy to explain to the kingdom exactly why I chose a woman of proven character and genuine accomplishments over the political marriages being forced upon me. The conviction in his tone surprised her. This was not just a tactical decision. It was a stand being taken on principle, a declaration that he valued authenticity over political convenience. Then yes, Elin said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the decision. I accept your proposal. The relief that crossed Roan's face was unmistakable, followed immediately by the focused determination of a commander implementing a crucial strategy. Around the table, his advisors began immediately discussing logistics, timing, documentation, messaging, and the countless details that would need to be managed to ensure their bold gambit succeeded. But as the planning session continued deep into the night, Elin found herself thinking less about political implications and more about the man who had just offered to share his throne with her. Whatever had prompted his proposal, genuine affection, tactical necessity, or some combination of both, he had chosen to trust her with his future and his kingdom's stability. It was a responsibility more daunting than any she had ever imagined, accepting and more rewarding than any honor she had ever thought to receive. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new complications, but tonight she fell asleep as a woman engaged to marry a king, her life transformed yet again by the unexpected generosity of fate. Dawn broke grey and cold over the mountain camp, with low clouds clinging to the peaks like smoke from some distant fire. Elin awakened to the sound of purposeful activity, not the routine preparations of a military camp settling into another day of campaign, but the focused energy of an army preparing for something significant. Through her tent walls, she could hear the distinctive sounds of weapons being checked, armor being adjusted, and horses being readied for hard travel. Today was her wedding day. The surreal nature of that thought struck her as she dressed in her best remaining gown, a simple blue wool dress that had seemed adequate for village life, but felt woefully inadequate for becoming a queen. In her traveling bag, she found her grandmother's silver brooch, a small piece of jewelry that had been passed down through 3 generations of healers. It seemed fitting to wear something that connected her to the women who had shaped her identity. Even as she prepared to step into a role none of them could have imagined, a soft scratch at her tent flap announced Marin's arrival, carrying a tray of food and an expression of barely contained excitement. "My lady," Marin whispered as she set down the tray, "is it true? Are you really to marry His Majesty today?" Word had apparently spread through the camp with the speed that only military gossip could achieve. Elin wondered what theories were being developed around the cook fires, what explanations the soldiers were creating for this sudden elevation of a woman who had appeared among them just days ago. "It appears so," Elin replied, accepting a cup of hot tea gratefully. "Though I confess the entire situation feels rather like a dream I haven't yet awakened from." "A good dream, though," Marin said with the optimism of youth. "The men are saying His Majesty looks happier than they've seen him in months, and Sir Geoffrey has been rushing about since before dawn, arranging things and sending messages. Sir Geoffrey's activities were indeed evidence that the marriage was being treated with full political seriousness, despite its improvised nature. Through the tent walls, Elin could hear him directing the preparation of official documents, the arrangement of witnesses, and the countless details that would ensure the ceremony's legitimacy could not be questioned by Rowan's enemies. Maren, Elin said carefully, what are the soldiers really saying about this marriage? I'd rather know the truth than be protected from unpleasant opinions. The young woman's face grew thoughtful. Mostly they're pleased, my lady. They've been worried about His Majesty for months, the pressure from court to choose a bride, the political games being played around him. Many of them think he's been too long without a woman who cares about him rather than his crown and the concerns. Some worry about what happens when we return to court, whether the noble families will accept you. Others wonder if this marriage might make His Majesty's political problems worse rather than better. Maren paused, then added with characteristic directness, but most figure that a king brave enough to marry for love might be brave enough to face down his enemies more generally. The comment struck Elin with unexpected force. The soldiers saw this marriage as an act of courage, rather than mere political calculation, a declaration that their king valued personal conviction over external pressure. It was a perspective she hadn't fully considered, and one that cast the entire situation in a different light. After Maren left, Elin spent time organizing her medical supplies and checking her healing kit. Whatever happened after the wedding ceremony, she would still be a healer, still responsible for tending to injuries and illnesses that occurred in their company. That identity provided solid ground beneath the swirling uncertainty of her new role as queen. A formal knock at her tent post announced the arrival of Sir Geoffrey, dressed in his finest clothes and carrying himself with the dignity appropriate to his role as witness to a royal wedding. "My lady," he said with a deep bow, "His Majesty requests your presence at the ceremony site when you are ready. The chaplain has arrived, and all arrangements have been completed." "Chaplain?" Elin asked, rising and smoothing her skirts nervously. "Father Benedict, who travels with our company to minister to the spiritual needs of the soldiers. He has full authority to perform marriages and has agreed to conduct the ceremony immediately." As they walked through the camp toward the designated area, Elin could feel the attention of hundreds of eyes following their progress. The soldiers had formed loose groups along their route, not quite formal ranks, but clearly positioned to witness this historic moment. Their faces showed mixtures of curiosity, approval, and genuine affection for their king, men who had followed Rowan through years of campaigning and wanted to see him find personal happiness alongside his professional duties. The ceremony site had been arranged in a small clearing at the camp's edge, where the ordered activity of military life gave way to the wild beauty of the mountain landscape. Someone had gathered wildflowers to create simple decorations, and the chaplain waited beside a makeshift altar constructed from stacked supply boxes covered with a clean white cloth. Rowan stood beside the altar wearing his finest military dress, a dark blue tunic embroidered with silver thread, polished leather, boots, and the sword that had accompanied him through countless battles. Around his neck hung a chain of office that marked him unmistakably as a king, but his expression was that of a man rather than a monarch, nervous, hopeful, and surprisingly vulnerable. Captain Marcus and several other senior officers served as witnesses, their presence lending additional weight to the ceremony's legitimacy. But it was the sight of ordinary soldiers gathered around the clearing's perimeter that moved Elin most deeply. These men had chosen to bear witness to their king's wedding, offering their silent support for a decision that might complicate all their lives. "Dearly beloved," Father Benedict began, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled company, We are gathered here in the sight of God and these witnesses to join together this man and this woman in holy matrimony. The familiar words took on extraordinary weight when applied to a king and a former village healer whose lives had intersected by chance just days earlier. Elin found herself focusing on Roan's face as the ceremony proceeded, noting the sincerity in his expression as he spoke his vows. I, Roan, take thee, Elin, to be my wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish till death us. O depart. When her turn came, Elin's voice remained steady, despite the magnitude of the promises she was making. I, Elin, take thee, Roan, to be my wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death us do part. The ring Roan placed on her finger was a simple gold band, elegant in its lack of ostentation. Later, she would learn that he had removed it from his own hand, a ring given to him by his grandfather, worn smooth by generations of Blackthorn kings. But in the moment of its placement, she was struck only by the warmth of his hands, and the gentleness with which he performed the traditional gesture. By the power vested in me by God and the Church, Father Benedict pronounced, I now pronounce, you husband and wife, what God has joined together, let no man put asunder. The cheer that rose from the assembled soldiers was spontaneous and heartfelt, a sound of genuine celebration that echoed off the surrounding mountain peaks. For a moment, all political considerations were forgotten in the simple joy of witnessing. Two people commit their lives to each other. But even as Roan kissed her gently to seal their union, Elin could see Sir Geoffrey already preparing to implement the next phase of their strategy. Marriage certificates needed to be signed, official announcements needed to be dispatched, and messages needed to be sent to the noble houses whose expectations had just been dramatically overturned. Your Majesty, Sir Geoffrey approached as the immediate congratulations concluded, the documentation is ready for your signatures, and the messengers are prepared to depart immediately for the capital. The return to political reality was swift and sobering. Within minutes of becoming queen, Elin found herself signing official documents that would announce her new status to the kingdom and formally notify the noble houses that their marriage proposals had been rendered moot. How long before Lord Ravencrest learns of this development? Roan asked as he affixed his royal seal to the last of the documents. 3 days, perhaps 4 if weather slows the messengers, Sir Geoffrey replied. But you can be certain his response will be swift and decisive. This marriage will be seen as a direct challenge to his authority and his plans. Captain Marcus joined their discussion, his weathered face serious. Sir, we should also consider our immediate tactical situation. If Ravencrest has been coordinating these mountain rebellions, he may have forces positioned to intercept us before we can return to defensible territory. The reminder brought Elin back to the reality of their circumstances. They were still in the middle of a military campaign, surrounded by potentially hostile territory, with an unknown number of enemies who now had additional reasons to want them dead or captured. What are our options? She asked, surprising herself by instinctively including herself in the strategic planning. Roan glanced at her with approval. We can continue toward Millhaven and complete our original mission, which would demonstrate that we're not intimidated by political pressure. Or we can begin an immediate withdrawal toward the capital, which might allow us to reach safety before Ravencrest can organize a response. And the third option? Elin asked, sensing there was more to consider. We could take the initiative. Captain Marcus said grimly. Use the intelligence we've gathered about Ravencrest's involvement to strike at his support network before he can strike at us. It was a bold suggestion, transforming their defensive posture into an aggressive campaign against their real enemy. But it was also dangerous, requiring them to split their forces and take risks that could prove fatal if their intelligence was incomplete. Time is our critical factor, Sir Geoffrey observed. "Every hour we delay gives Ravencrest more opportunity to organize a response. Whatever we decide, we need to decide quickly." Elin studied the map spread on the campaign table, noting the positions of known loyal forces, suspected enemy concentrations, and the various routes available for movement through the mountain passes. Her knowledge of the region was limited, but she could see the strategic challenges they faced. Too few reliable allies, too many unknown variables, and too little time to gather additional intelligence. "What would happen if we simply disappeared?" she asked. "Instead of making predictable moves toward either Millhaven or the capital, what if we took an unexpected route that kept our enemies guessing about our intentions?" The suggestion caught the attention of everyone around the table. It was a classic misdirection strategy, refusing to play the game according to expected rules and forcing opponents to react to uncertainty rather than implementing predetermined plans. "It has possibilities," Rowan said thoughtfully. "If we could mask our true destination while creating false trails, we could buy time to consolidate our position while Ravencrest wastes resources pursuing phantoms," Captain Marcus finished. "It's risky, but it might be our best option given the circumstances." As the strategic discussion continued, Elin found herself thinking about the extraordinary changes the past few days had brought. She had gone from being cargo to being a queen, from being powerless to being part of the decision-making process that would determine the fate of an entire kingdom. But more than that, she was beginning to understand that her marriage to Rowan represented something larger than personal salvation or political convenience. It was a declaration that worth could be found in unexpected places, that value existed beyond traditional measures of success, and that genuine partnership could transcend the calculated alliances that typically characterized royal marriages. The sun was climbing higher over the mountain peaks, burning away the morning clouds and revealing the path ahead with crystalline clarity. Soon they would be riding toward whatever confrontation awaited them, carrying with them all the hopes and fears that accompanied any bold gambit. But as they prepared to break camp and begin their journey into an uncertain future, Elin reflected on the strange turns that had brought her to this moment. Yesterday she had been a displaced healer, trying to find her place in an unfamiliar world. Today she was a queen, riding beside her king toward a destiny that neither of them could fully predict, but that both had chosen to embrace together. 2. Marriage certificate bore their signatures in dark ink, making their union a matter of official record that would ripple outward through the political structures of the kingdom. But beyond the legal formalities and strategic implications, Elin carried with her the memory of Rowan's gentle hands and sincere vows, evidence that their partnership was built on more than mere convenience. Whatever lay ahead in the mountains and valleys beyond, they would face it as husband and wife, two people who had found in each other something worth defending against all the forces arrayed against them. The ambush came at midday, when the sun was high enough to create deceptive shadows among the rocky outcroppings that lined the narrow mountain pass. Rowan's company had been traveling in careful formation, with scouts ranging ahead and flankers positioned to prevent surprise attacks. But the enemy had chosen their position with deadly precision, a natural bottleneck where the path narrowed. Between sheer cliff faces, offering no room for maneuver and limited options for retreat, Elin felt the change in atmosphere before she heard the first arrow whistle past her ear. The soldiers around her shifted subtly in their saddles, hands moving instinctively toward weapons as trained senses detected the wrongness that preceded an attack. Even the horses seemed to sense the danger, their ears pricking forward and their steps becoming more cautious as they navigated the treacherous footing. "Ambush positions!" Captain Marcus roared, his voice echoing off the canyon walls, as arrows began raining down from concealed archers positioned on the cliffs above. "Shields up! Protect the king!" The attack had been planned with military precision rather than the desperate improvisation of local rebels. The archers were positioned to create overlapping fields of fire, while additional forces blocked both ends of the pass to prevent escape. This was not a spontaneous uprising. It was a coordinated military operation designed to eliminate Roan and his company with ruthless efficiency. Roan's soldiers responded with the disciplined competence of veterans, forming protective formations around their king while seeking cover among the scattered boulders that dotted the canyon floor. But even their skill and experience couldn't overcome the fundamental disadvantage of their position. They were trapped in a killing ground, facing an enemy that held every tactical advantage. "Elin!" Roan called over the sound of clashing steel, and shouted orders. "Stay close to me. Don't try to help the wounded until we break free of this trap." She could see injured men falling around them, struck down by arrows or wounded in the fierce hand-to-hand combat that erupted as enemy soldiers poured down from the cliffs to finish what their archers had started. Every instinct screamed at her to rush to their aid, to use her healing skills to save lives that were being lost with each passing moment. But she forced herself to remain beside Roan, understanding that her survival was crucial to more than just her personal welfare. Today, battle raged with savage intensity, the narrow confines of the pass amplifying every sound until the clash of weapons became deafening. Roan fought with the skill and ferocity that had made him legendary among his enemies, his swordwork precise and deadly as he cut down attackers who tried to reach his position. Beside him, Captain Marcus wielded his battle axe with devastating effect, creating a protective barrier around their king that no enemy could penetrate. But despite their courage and skill, Elin could see that they were being overwhelmed. For every enemy soldier that fell, 2 more seemed to take his place, and their own forces were being steadily depleted by the constant rain of arrows from above. They needed a miracle or a brilliant tactical innovation, preferably both. "The path ahead is blocked," Sir Geoffrey shouted, his normally immaculate appearance now disheveled by combat. "Heavy barricades with archers behind them. We can't punch through without losing half our remaining men." "And the rear?" Roan demanded, parrying a sword thrust while simultaneously assessing their tactical situation. "Same story. We're boxed in completely." Elin studied the canyon walls, rising on either side of their position, noting the steep but potentially climbable paths that the enemy had used to reach their archery positions. The ascent would be dangerous under the best of circumstances, but with arrows falling around them and armed opponents waiting above, it seemed like suicide. But as she watched their situation deteriorate, a desperate plan began forming in her mind. It was risky beyond reason, requiring precise timing and more luck than anyone had a right to expect, but it might be their only chance to break free of the trap that was slowly closing around them. "Roan!" she called, ducking instinctively as another arrow shattered against the boulder protecting them. "I have an idea, but it requires creating a distraction that will draw their attention away from the cliff paths." "What kind of distraction?" he asked, never taking his eyes off the enemies pressing closer to their position. "A queen trying to escape." The words hung in the air between them, carrying implications that made Captain Marcus curse creatively, while Sir Geoffrey went pale beneath his battle grime. They understood immediately what she was proposing, using herself as bait to draw the enemy's focus, while Roan's forces attempted a desperate flanking maneuver. "Absolutely not," Roan said firmly. "I won't risk your life on such a plan." "You won't be risking it," Elin replied with forced calm. "I'll be risking it myself to save all of ours. Look around. We're going to die here if we don't try something desperate." Another volley of arrows forced them deeper behind their improvised cover, while the sound of approaching footsteps indicated that the enemy was preparing for a final assault. In minutes, their protective circle would be overrun, and even Roan's legendary skill wouldn't be enough to save them. "The eastern slope," Captain Marcus said reluctantly, his tactical mind already working through the possibilities. If we could get a small force up there without being detected, they might be able to take the archers from behind, while a queen provides a visible target that draws all attention toward the western approach, Sir Geoffrey added with obvious reluctance. It could work, but only if the timing is perfect. Roan looked at Elin with an expression that mixed desperate love with professional calculation. She could see him weighing her life against the lives of his men, his personal feelings against his duties as a king and commander. It was an impossible choice, made more agonizing by the fact that they had been married less than 12 hours. "I can reach that cluster of rocks near the western path," Elin said, pointing to a position that would be clearly visible to the enemy archers. "If I make enough noise trying to escape, they'll focus on capturing the queen instead of watching. For your flanking attack. And if they simply shoot you down, instead of trying to capture you alive, then I'll die as a queen rather than as cargo," she replied simply. "But I don't think they'll risk killing me. I'm too valuable as a hostage to waste with casual arrows." It was true, though the knowledge provided limited comfort. Lord Ravencrest would want her taken alive if possible, both for the political leverage she represented and for the public spectacle that a captured queen could provide. That calculation might give her just enough protection to survive long enough. For Roan's plan to succeed, the sound of enemy voices grew closer, indicating that the final assault was moments away. There was no more time for debate or elaborate planning. They had to act immediately or accept death in this anonymous mountain pass. "Do it," Roan said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "But promise me you'll be careful. Promise me you'll survive this." "I promise to try," Elin said, which was all the honesty she could offer in their current circumstances. She kissed him quickly, tasting the salt of sweat and the metallic tang of blood on his lips, then broke from their protective cover and began making her way toward the western slope. Behind her, she could hear Roan organizing his men for the desperate flanking maneuver that represented their only hope of survival. The enemy reaction was immediate and dramatic. Shouts went up from the cliff positions as archers spotted her movement, and she could hear officers barking orders to capture rather than kill the fleeing queen. Arrows struck the ground around her feet, close enough to be terrifying but not quite close enough to wound, evidence that her calculation about being taken alive had been correct. "There, the woman! Don't let her escape!" The pursuit was swift and determined, with enemy soldiers abandoning their positions to give chase to what they saw as a panicking royal target. It was exactly the reaction Elin had hoped for, drawing attention and resources away from Roan's true objective. But as she scrambled up the rocky slope, fighting for purchase on loose stone and exposed roots, she began to understand just how dangerous her gambit truly was. The men pursuing her were experienced mountain fighters, familiar with this terrain and motivated by the enormous prize she represented. Even if Rowan's flanking attack succeeded, she might not survive long enough to benefit from their victory. The pursuit up the western slope became a deadly game of cat and mouse, with Elin using every piece of cover the rocky terrain provided, while her enemies closed the distance with methodical precision. She could hear their boots scraping against stone behind her, accompanied by the harsh breathing of men pushing themselves to capture a prize that could change the political landscape of the entire kingdom. Her healing satchel bounced against her hip as she climbed, the familiar weight now feeling like an anchor that slowed her progress up the treacherous slope. But she couldn't abandon it. Not just because the medical supplies might prove crucial later, but because the worn leather bag represented her identity as something more than a political pawn. "Careful with her!" one of the pursuers called out. "Lord Ravencrest wants her taken alive and unharmed. She's worth more as a hostage than a corpse." The confirmation of Ravencrest's involvement sent a chill through Elin that had nothing to do with the mountain air. This wasn't just a military ambush, it was a precisely orchestrated political assassination designed to eliminate Rowan while capturing his new queen for use as leverage against any remaining loyal forces. She reached a small ledge that provided momentary concealment and pressed herself against the cliff face, trying to catch her breath while listening for sounds that would indicate whether Rowan's flanking attack was succeeding. From her elevated position, she could see down into the canyon where the main battle continued to rage, but the angle made it difficult to determine how the engagement was progressing. "Queen Elin!" a voice called from below, carrying the false courtesy of someone trying to negotiate from a position of strength. "There's no need for this dangerous climb. Surrender yourself peacefully, and no harm will come to you or your husband." The lie was so transparent it might have been amusing under different circumstances, even if they intended to keep her alive. For political purposes, Rowan's survival was the last thing Ravencrest's forces wanted. Her husband was fighting for his life in the canyon below, outnumbered and surrounded, while she scrambled up a mountainside in a desperate attempt to buy him the tactical advantage he needed. A loose stone rattled past her hiding place, dislodged by one of her pursuers, who was gaining ground despite the difficult terrain. She could hear at least 3 different voices coordinating their approach, which meant she was being hunted by a full squad rather than individual soldiers acting on impulse. From somewhere above her position came the sound of steel clashing against steel, evidence that Rowan's men had successfully reached the enemy archer positions and were engaging them in hand-to-hand combat. The plan was working, but slowly, and she wasn't certain she could evade capture long enough for the tactical situation to shift in their favor. "My lady," another voice called, this one closer and more confident. "I can see your position. There's nowhere left to run, and the rocks ahead are too steep for safe climbing. Be sensible and come down before someone gets hurt." Elin peered around the edge of her concealment and saw a grizzled sergeant climbing steadily toward her, his movements practiced and sure despite the challenging terrain. Behind him, 2 younger soldiers provided support, ready to cut off any escape route she might attempt. She was trapped, but as she studied the cliff face above her position, Elin noticed something the soldiers below had missed: a narrow crack in the rock that might provide handholds for someone desperate enough to attempt a truly dangerous ascent. It wasn't a path that any sane person would choose, but sanity had become a luxury she couldn't afford. The crack led upward toward a section of cliff where the sounds of combat were loudest, suggesting that Rowan's flanking force was engaged directly above her position. If she could reach them, she might find protection among friendly forces rather than capture among enemies. It was an insane risk. One slip would send her tumbling down the cliff face to certain death, and even success would only bring her into the middle of an active battle. But the alternative, allowing herself to be captured and used as a weapon against Rowan, was unacceptable. She began climbing again, this time abandoning all attempts at stealth in favor of speed. The crack in the rock provided barely adequate handholds, and more than once she felt her fingers slip on the smooth stone, saving herself only through desperate strength and stubborn determination. "She's making for the top," the sergeant called out, his voice carrying a note of genuine admiration despite their adversarial relationship. "Move faster. She's more resourceful than we anticipated." The pursuit intensified, with her enemies taking greater risks to close the distance before she could reach whatever sanctuary awaited above. But their caution in preserving her life intact worked to her advantage. They couldn't simply shoot her down, which limited their options for stopping her ascent. As she pulled herself up the final section of the crack, Elin's fingers found purchase on solid ground rather than stone. She had reached a narrow ledge where several of Rowan's soldiers were engaged in fierce combat with the enemy archers who had been raining death down on the canyon below. "Your Majesty!" one of the soldiers called out in amazement, parrying a sword. Thrust while glancing in her direction. "How in God's name did you get up here?" "The same way our enemies did," she replied, drawing the small knife she carried in her healing kit, hardly a weapon suitable for combat, but better than facing armed opponents with empty hands. "And the same way they're still coming," the sergeant and his men had followed her up the cliff face, their pursuit now bringing additional enemies into what had been a successful flanking attack. The tactical advantage Rohan's men had gained was being eroded by the very rescue they were trying to provide her. But even as the situation became more desperate, Elin noticed something that changed her understanding of their circumstances. Among the enemy dead scattered across the ledge, she recognized faces from her brief time in Greyhold, men who had lived in her village, who had accepted her healing services while simultaneously judging her as worthless. "These aren't just Ravencrest's soldiers," she called out to the nearest friendly fighter. "Some of them are from my own village. They've been recruited locally." The revelation explained much about the ambush's precision and timing. The enemy hadn't just been watching Rohan's movements. They had been guided by people who knew the terrain intimately and who had personal knowledge of the Royal Company's composition and capabilities. But it also suggested a vulnerability in the enemy's organization. Local recruits might be familiar with the mountains, but they would lack the discipline and training of professional soldiers. They would be more likely to break under pressure, more susceptible to psychological warfare than purely military tactics. "Listen to me," Elin called out, her voice carrying clearly across the ledge as she addressed both friend and foe. "I know some of you. You're men from Greyhold and the surrounding settlements. You've been told lies about your king and about me." The effect was immediate and dramatic. Several of the enemy soldiers hesitated in their attacks, clearly struggling with conflicting loyalties as they recognized the voice of the woman who had healed their injuries and tended their families. "You know me as Elin, the healer," she continued, pressing her advantage. "I've delivered your children, treated your fevers, mended your wounds. Whatever you've been told about why you're fighting here today, remember who I really am." From the canyon below came the sound of renewed fighting, suggesting that the confusion on the ledge was being reflected throughout the enemy forces. Men who had been united in their attack were now questioning their motivations, creating opportunities. Uperon's outnumbered forces to exploit. The sergeant who had pursued her up the cliff face was among those affected by her words. She could see recognition dawning in his eyes, followed by uncertainty and growing anger, not at her, but at those who had manipulated him into this position. "You're the healer who set my son's broken arm last winter," he said slowly, lowering his sword. "The one who saved my wife when the fever nearly took her." "I am," Elin confirmed, "and these men you're fighting are loyal soldiers serving their rightful king. Whatever Lord Ravencrest promised you for this attack, it wasn't worth betraying people who have never harmed you." The psychological tide was turning, but the situation remained precarious. Professional soldiers among the enemy forces were still fighting with disciplined determination, and the local recruits who recognized Elin were caught between conflicting loyalties that could break either way. From somewhere below came Rohan's voice, strong and clear despite the ongoing combat. "Elin, if you can hear me, we're pushing through. Hold your position." The sound of her husband's voice, alive and fighting effectively, gave her the strength to continue pressing their advantage. Around the ledge, she could see the battle reaching its crucial turning point, the moment when victory or defeat would be decided by courage, determination, and the choices made by ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances. "Choose!" she called out to the wavering enemy soldiers. "Choose between the lies you've been told and the truth you know. I am Elin of Greyhold, your healer and now your queen. Stand with me or stand against everything you've ever claimed to believe." The challenge hung in the mountain air like the echo of distant thunder, carrying with it the power to transform a military engagement into something far more significant, a moment when the future of a kingdom would be decided not by political maneuvering, but by the fundamental human capacity to recognize truth in the midst of deception. The moment of choice stretched across the mountain ledge like a held breath, with men from Greyhold and the surrounding settlements looking into the eyes of the woman they had known as a healer and now saw as their queen. In that silence, the larger battle raging throughout the canyon seemed to pause, as if the mountain itself was waiting to see which way the tide of loyalty would turn. The sergeant who had pursued Elin up the cliff face was the first to make his decision. With deliberate ceremony, he reversed his grip on his sword and offered the hilt to her in the traditional gesture of surrender and service. "My sword is yours, Your Majesty," he said, his weathered face showing a mixture of shame and determination. "We were told lies about you and His Majesty. We were told you were foreign spies sent to weaken the kingdom from within." His surrender broke the psychological dam that had been holding back the other local recruits. One by one, the men from Greyhold and the mountain settlements laid down their weapons, their faces showing the dawning understanding of how thoroughly they had been manipulated by forces beyond their comprehension. "Lord Ravencrest's agents came to our villages months ago," another man explained, his voice heavy with regret. "They spoke of threats to our traditional ways, of foreign influences corrupting the crown. They promised us gold and land if we helped rid the kingdom of these supposed enemies. But not all of the enemy forces were so easily swayed. The professional soldiers among Ravencrest's forces recognized that their position was rapidly deteriorating and chose to fight rather than surrender. The ledge erupted into renewed combat as those still loyal to the conspiracy made a desperate attempt to complete their mission. Elin found herself in the middle of a swirling melee, her small knife inadequate for the fierce fighting that raged around her. But the men from Greyhold had positioned themselves as her protectors, using their local knowledge of the terrain to create defensive positions that channeled the remaining enemies into disadvantageous approaches. From the canyon below, she could hear the sounds of victory as Roan's forces, bolstered by the defection of the local recruits, began overwhelming the ambush that had seemed so deadly just minutes earlier. The tactical situation had reversed completely, transforming certain defeat into decisive triumph through the power of personal recognition and shared trust. "Elin!" Roan's voice called from the base of the cliff, strong and relieved. "The canyon is secure. Can you make your way down safely?" Looking over the ledge, she could see her husband standing among the bodies of fallen enemies, his sword still in his hand, but his attention focused entirely on her welfare. Around him, his soldiers were securing the area and tending to their wounded, while groups of former enemies knelt in surrender. "The western path is clear now," the sergeant informed her, pointing to a route that would allow safe descent. "Your Majesty's courage has saved us all from a terrible mistake." As they made their way down from the ledge, Elin reflected on the extraordinary turn of events that had transformed a deadly ambush into a decisive victory. The battle had been won not through superior military tactics or overwhelming force, but through the simple power of human recognition, the understanding that shared experience and mutual trust could overcome even carefully orchestrated deception. At the base of the cliff, Roan gathered her into his arms, with the desperate relief of a man who had thought his world was ending. For a moment, they simply held each other, both understanding how close they had come to losing everything they had gained in their brief time together. "That was the most terrifying and brilliant thing I've ever witnessed," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You turned our enemies into our allies through nothing more than truth and courage." "I simply reminded them of who they really were," Elin replied. "Beneath all the lies and manipulation, they were still the people I had known and served." That connection proved stronger than the false promises they had been given. Captain Marcus approached with a collection of documents recovered from the enemy dead, orders and correspondence that revealed the full scope of Ravencrest's conspiracy. The mountain rebellions had indeed been artificially created, designed, to keep Roan away from court, while political opposition was organized against him. "This evidence should be sufficient to expose the entire plot," Sir Geoffrey observed, examining the captured papers. Lord Ravencrest's involvement is documented in detail, along with the names of his co-conspirators and their planned timeline for action. But even as they celebrated their tactical victory, Elin could see the larger challenges that lay ahead. They had survived the immediate threat, but Ravencrest would not abandon his ambitions simply because one ambush had failed. The political battle for control of the kingdom was just beginning, and their enemies would adapt their strategies in response to this defeat. "What happens now?" she asked, watching as the wounded from both sides were brought together for medical treatment, a task that fell naturally to her as the only trained healer present. "Now we return to court," Rowan replied, his expression showing the grim determination of a king preparing for political warfare. "We present the evidence of this conspiracy to the full nobility, and we demonstrate that our marriage represents strength rather than weakness." Over the following hours, as they organized their return journey and treated the injured, Elin began to understand the full significance of what they had accomplished. The men from Greyhold who had joined their cause would return to their villages as witnesses to the truth about their king and queen. Word would spread throughout the mountain settlements about the healer who had become a queen, about the king who had chosen love over political convenience, and about the victory that had been won through courage rather than calculation. "Your Majesty," the sergeant who had surrendered to her approached as she finished treating a wounded soldier's arrow wound. "My men and I would like to request permission to serve in your personal guard. We failed you once through ignorance. We would like the opportunity to make amends through loyal service." The request surprised her, but it also highlighted the profound changes that had resulted from the day's events. These men had chosen to follow her, not because of political obligation or royal decree, but because of personal conviction and genuine respect. It was a form of loyalty that no amount of gold or land grants could purchase. "I would be honored to have you in my service," she replied. "But understand that following me means dedicating yourselves to healing rather than harming, to building rather than destroying. Can you accept such a charge?" The sergeant smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. "My lady, after seeing what you accomplished today with nothing but truth and courage, I believe healing and building are the most powerful forces in the world." As the sun began to set over the mountain peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, their combined forces prepared to begin the journey back toward the capital. They traveled now as a larger company, strengthened by the addition of men whose loyalty had been tested and proven in the crucible of actual combat. Elin rode beside Rowan, her healing satchel secure across her shoulder and her grandmother's silver brooch glinting in the evening light. The simple blue dress she had worn for her wedding was now stained with dust and blood from the day's adventures, but she felt more like a queen than any amount of silk and jewelry could have made her. "Do you regret anything about this extraordinary day?" Rowan asked, as they settled into the steady rhythm of travel. She considered the question carefully, thinking about the morning's wedding ceremony, the afternoon's deadly ambush, and the evening's unexpected triumph. It had been a day of transformations, from village healer to queen, from political liability to strategic asset, from someone defined by her failures to someone celebrated for her accomplishments. "I regret that people had to die before the truth could be recognized," she said finally. "But I don't regret the choices we made or the risks we took. For the first time in my life, I feel as though I'm exactly where I belong." The path ahead led through mountain passes toward a distant city where political battles awaited them, where enemies would try to use their marriage as evidence of poor judgment, and where the future of the kingdom would be decided through careful maneuvering and public presentation. But they would face those challenges together, as partners united by something stronger than political convenience. Behind them, the battlefield where they had won their first victory together grew small and distant, just another landmark in the mountain landscape. But the significance of what had happened there would echo through the years ahead, Proof that genuine connection could overcome manufactured division, that truth could triumph over deception, and that love, freely chosen, was stronger than alliances imposed by others. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Elin reflected on the strange journey that had brought her from a merchant's cart to a queen's throne in the space of just a few days. She thought of her parents, who had sold her for 3 silver coins, and wondered if they would ever understand that their desperate act had actually freed her to discover her true worth. She thought of Henrik, the old man in Greyhold, who had always treated her with kindness, and hoped that word of her elevation would bring him comfort in his final years. She thought of all the people she had healed over the years, all the lives she had touched through her knowledge and compassion, and realized that those experiences had prepared her for exactly the role she now occupied. Most of all, she thought, about the small seedling that would soon be planted in the royal garden, a symbol of new life taking root in unexpected soil, growing into something beautiful and strong despite humble beginnings. Like that seedling, her own transformation from discarded daughter to beloved queen proved that worth existed wherever one chose to nurture it, and that the most remarkable journeys often began with the most ordinary steps. The mountain road stretched ahead toward whatever challenges and opportunities awaited them in the capital, but Elin no longer feared the future. She had learned that she was stronger than she had ever imagined, that love could indeed triumph over circumstance, and that sometimes the most important victories were won not through force of arms, but through the simple courage to be authentically oneself. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, blessing the journey of a king and queen who had found in each other not just political alliance, but genuine partnership. And in that blessing, the promise of a kingdom transformed by the radical idea that every person possessed inherent worth, regardless of their ability to meet others' expectations or fulfill traditional roles. Their story had begun with betrayal and rejection, but it would be remembered as a testament to the power of recognition, redemption, and the kind of love that chose to see value where others saw only failure. In the years to come, when other discarded daughters and forgotten sons faced impossible circumstances, they would remember the tale of Elin the healer, who became a queen not despite her humble origins, but because of the strength those origins had given her. The future stretched ahead, full of promise and possibility, as endless and welcoming as the star-filled sky above their heads.